Ready to start. So Deb, just count to 5 in your head.
Hello, I'm Debra Steidel Wall, Deputy Archivist of the United States at the National Archives, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's panel discussion, the 100th anniversary of women winning the vote, Reflections on the 2020 Centennial. We're presenting this program in partnership with the Women's Suffrage Centennial Commission and with support from the 2020 Women's Vote Centennial Initiative. The Women's Suffrage Centennial Commission has shepherded 19th Amendment commemorations around the country. Today's discussion is the final installment in its series of programs and celebrations. I've been honored to serve as commissioner for the last 2 years. During that time, the Commission promoted the Centennial observance with a tremendous assortment of programs and events. And our celebration culminated this past August on the actual 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Although this year's public health crisis meant that our commemoration had to pivot to largely online outlets, we nonetheless succeeded in raising awareness of this important landmark in voting rights. At the National Archives, we preserve and make available the records of the federal government so that our citizens can learn our country's history and be informed participants in the civic process. As the home of the actual 19th Amendment, we were especially proud to share and raise awareness of records relating to suffrage. We've presented numerous programs and exhibitions, including our Rightfully Hers, American Women and the Vote exhibit, Rightfully Hers pop-up displays across the country, and many discussions and film screenings, including the 25th anniversary screening of One Woman, One Vote, as well as the virtual programs we presented on August 26 as part of the Commission's Forward into Light celebration of Women's Equality Day. Our exhibit, Rightfully Hers, opened in March 2019 in the National Archives building in Washington, D.C. It tells the story of women's struggle for voting rights as a critical step toward equal citizenship. Although the physical exhibit was forced to close in March 2020, its online version is available on archives.gov, enabling people everywhere to explore how American women across the spectrum of race, ethnicity, and class advanced the cause of suffrage both before ratification of the 19th Amendment and beyond. So now let's begin our discussion of the Centennial commemoration with an introduction of our 4 panelists, who are all current and former chairs and vice chairs of the Commission. Senator Barbara Mikulski has dedicated her life to public service. In 2011, she became the longest-serving female senator, and the following year, the longest-serving woman in Congress, having served in both the House and the Senate. She was also the first woman to chair the Senate Committee on Appropriations. Kay Coles-James is president of the Heritage Foundation. She's worked at the local, state, and federal levels of government under the administrations of former U.S. President George H.W. Bush, former Virginia Governor George Allen, and former U.S. President George W. Bush. Colleen Shogan is Senior Vice President of the White House Historical Association and previously worked in the U.S. Senate and as a senior executive at the Library of Congress. She teaches at Georgetown University in the Government Department. And finally, Susan Combs is the former Assistant Secretary for Policy, Management, and Budget for the U.S. Department of the Interior. She previously served in the Texas legislature, writing and passing private property legislation and working to ensure greater transparency in government spending. So welcome, ladies, and it's good to see you again. I would like to start with a question for Susan. So Susan, as the current chair of the Commission, can you give us an overview of the Commission, how and why it was formed, its mission and guiding principles, and some of its projects?
Great. I'm delighted to be able to lead this off. So let me give you a little bit of history. Senator Tammy Baldwin from Wisconsin sort of started the ball rolling on this back in 2017, realizing that the 100th anniversary was going to be coming up pretty shortly. And she got the support of every woman senator to be nonpartisan, and they all adopted and passed. And so this commission was established with 14 members, some selected by the president, some by both members of the parties in the House and the Senate, and then 4 other federal departments were in it. And so we have worked together And we were, by the statute, required to do 5 particular functions. And so the first job we had to do, our first duty, was to encourage and develop programs that commemorated this incredible period in the United States history. Secondly, we were to also encourage both private and state and local entities to see what they could do to organize activities commemorating the fight for suffrage. Thirdly, we were to facilitate and coordinate activities over all the U.S., which is a very daunting task, but I want to say that it amazingly enough got done. And then fourth, we were to serve as a clearinghouse at the commission for all of the material that we got, and then, of course, see that there were ways to disseminate this across the country. And then last but not least, we were to develop recommendations for Congress and the President for activities that they might develop. And of course, the key thing here, which I think was really important, was that we were to do all of this in completely nonpartisan fashion. And that was a very important guiding principle. We weren't guided just by the duties and the obligations, but also by our focus. So I think we did a bang-up job, and we had a huge outreach. We had TV, print, social media, radio, etc., speeches, podcasts. So we covered all of the platforms that existed. And then we did projects across the U.S. as well as local. National parks participated, Smithsonian's participated, Library of Congress, archives, cities, communities, counties. There were sort of pop-ups all over the country. There was a stamp created, a medal, and a coin to commemorate this incredible activity. And we also didn't lose sight of raising a few funds, so we sold the story. We sold the story through what we call the Suff Shop, the Suffrage Shop, and we contacted and reached 66,000 Americans and made $60,000 in sales. We had 3,000 kinds of items, 3,000 items shipped. T-shirts, mugs, lapel pins, playing cards, note cards, Christmas cards, everything. And I will tell you, there's another shopping day in your future. Get online, go to the Suff Shop. You'll have an opportunity to shop. And of course, what I want to say is really related to the legacy. With the pandemic, we did have to shift and pivot. And I think actually it helped us leave a longer-term legacy in place. We've got art projects, we have murals, we have structures. There's a piece of the actual White House fence that people, women and men, protested in front of. It's now going to be out in Virginia. We have statues. We have statues in Tennessee, Seneca Falls, Virginia. There are trails, the women's trails in about 45, 50 states. And then, but last but not least, on the educational front, we partnered with the American Library Association, and we funded, I love this number, 17,964 books that were distributed to 2,842 libraries and covering all 50 states and Puerto Rico and the Northern Marianas. And I think that is really wonderful. We're going to continue to see these legacy things for years to come. This is not it ended in August of 2020. We think that we have fulfilled not just the congressional directive, its spirit and goals, but really reminded America how a 70-plus year struggle resulted in the single largest voter enfranchisement in the history of the United States. And I think it's a tremendous accomplishment for those incredibly tenacious and persistent and powerful men and women to get this done. They fought so hard for the citizens' right to vote, and I think all of us on the commission thought this was a powerful and rewarding task for us to take on.
Thank you, Susan. I think that's all true, and it's just amazing the scope, the range, and the volume of what we were able to produce, in no large part, as we've all recognized, thanks to our amazing staff, including our executive director, Anna Lehman. And the T-shirts were very good. So I'd like to turn to Colleen. So Colleen, Women's fight for the vote was one of the longest and largest social and political movements in American history. Why isn't the suffrage story, the women of suffrage story, more widely known or taught? I thought I knew about the history of it and have really learned how much more complex and complicated the story is. Do you think the Centennial has changed that for future generations?
Thanks, Deb, for that question. I want to thank you for all of your work on the commission, and certainly the partnership between the National Archives, the Smithsonian, and the Library of Congress, our three major cultural institutions in the country and in Washington, D.C., who have really been true partners to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. I think that's an important legacy to remember. Previously we may not have worked together all the time in the past, but certainly for this, we have established an important legacy and an important example for how to go forward in celebrating, commemorating these important anniversaries. But to your question, for many, many years, American history wasn't as inclusive, obviously, as it has been taught now. Women's history, the history of African Americans, was largely viewed as perhaps by some as important, but ancillary to the main story of American history. That certainly was my experience when I grew up. Went to high school in the 1990s. I had a very good American history teacher who was really responsible for getting me interested in American history, but we didn't read two chapters in my advanced American history book. One was on women's history and one was on African American history. And I asked him why we didn't read those two chapters, because I was, probably a bit of a nebbish student, even as a high school student, and asked him, and he said, well, we simply don't have the time to go into these histories. We have to be focused on actually what happened and talking about understanding the basics so that you can understand more of a perspective later on. And I think what has changed in our perspective of American history, those of us who study American history, those of us who teach American history, either at the university level or at the high school or even the elementary and middle grades level, is that we don't view women's history or African American history or all these other parts and components of American history as ancillary anymore. We view them as actually part of the record, as part of the American story and part of the experience. And in fact, if you don't include those stories in your teaching of American history, you're doing a disservice to your students. You're doing a disservice to teaching them really an accurate portrayal of American history. I think the commission has done an excellent job. Susan talked a little bit about it concerning its educational functions. I think the ALA partnership with the American Library Association, which she referenced, distributing tens of thousands of books to our nation's libraries that need those books the most. There will always be a book for all different grade levels about the American women's suffrage movement now in the collections of these libraries, so that future students, when they are assigned their history project, they will have the option of having a quality resource to be able to understand the comprehensive history of the women's suffrage movement. And then also some of these other projects that Susan referenced, really the history markers throughout 50 states, the statues, these should all be viewed as educational teaching tools for generations of children and students to come, because they will spark class field trips to these new statues and these new memorials that will then provide the information and really jumping off point to understand the rich and really complex history of the women's suffrage movement. I think on a scholarly level, we've also done a terrific job in supporting scholars and scholarly research that has told this comprehensive story of the women's suffrage movement. We did that through our suffrage blogs, almost 30 blogs from original research and work from top scholars all across the United States with different reflections about different aspects of the women's suffrage movement, all collected together also on our website in one digital book. So it can be used easily for classroom adoption at either the high school or the college level going forward, and a free resource in which to do so. So I think that when I look back at the past year in particular and my time on the commission, that is what I'm most happy about, what I'm most proud about, is that I think we've changed the story of women's suffrage and how it's been told. And we've also provided the mechanisms in which so that educators at all levels can tell that story.
Thanks, Colleen. I think you're right. We've left a legacy and a framework for the continuing study of the story. At the dedication of the National Museum of African American History and Culture in 2016, President George W. Bush said, "A great nation does not hide its history. It faces its flaws and corrects them." Institutions like the National Archives have worked hard this year to face those flaws in the story of women's fight for the vote and to address the role of race and prejudice in the suffrage movement. As a commissioner, I know that we all agreed that telling the complete story of the suffrage movement was one of our guiding principles. Senator Mikulski, I'd like to start this with you, but open it up to everyone to add to if they'd like. Can you please speak to the Commission's role in telling the complete story of the suffrage movement? And is it possible for us to celebrate the suffragists and their achievements while also acknowledging their flaws?
Well, I think the Commission, first of all, wanted to follow the congressional mandate, which was to tell the story of this incredible social movement that empowered 50% of the population. And we want to reaffirm the principle that studying American history is important and to own the entire narrative. The study of history is important because it tells us who we are, where we've been, to follow the things of the Commission, to remember, to reflect, and actually recommit the pursuit of expanding democracy. And I was very proud of the way the Commission did this, and want to salute the initial chair, Kay Cole James, and I was the vice chair, to get the Commission off to the start where we wanted to have the whole narrative. The story of suffrage is an incredible one of organizing and strategizing, but it wasn't only the story of Seneca Falls and then leap forward to the ratification day in Tennessee. It was hard-earned, hard-fought. You know, when they say women got the right to vote, nobody gave it to us. We fought for it. And in fighting for it, there were compromises and even poor strategic visions. It wasn't only about what happened at Seneca Falls. It was the entire journey that brought us to Tennessee and the final ratification. It's a story of great effort, good, and yet at the same time of exclusion. And the story of Black, brown, and indigenous people were often excluded. And it was the Commission who said, following on the framework espoused by President Bush, let's tell the whole story. Let's take a look and see what was good, what was not so good, what was inclusive, what was exclusionary, so that when we look ahead to the next century of the empowerment of all American people, that we make sure that everybody's included and everybody's welcomed, and that we base this on sound historical scholarship where there are no hidden figures.
Excellent. Thank you. Anyone else? How do we celebrate the remarkable achievements of the suffragists while also acknowledging the flaws of them as individuals and of the movement?
I mean, I think from a politics perspective, from a social movement perspective, actually looking at the low points, looking at the points in which the movement suffered setbacks, in which perhaps cooperation and collaboration was not at its pinnacle or at its peak. But then knowing that the movement lasted, by most historian standpoints, for spanned 8 decades, 72 years. But the fact that it kept coming back and finding new and interesting ways in which to advance the cause forward, I think that's the interesting story for historians, for political scientists, for sociologists who study social movements. So, nobody wants to read about a movement, for 70 years that was just all, a rosy picture. That would be a pretty boring story. And if it was such a rosy picture, then why did it last for 72 years? So there's got to be some twists and turns, some ups and downs, and some decisions that we can look back and say, gosh, maybe we wouldn't make those decisions today if we looked back at them. And I think that's what makes the history rich.
Deb, I really think that's one of the most important lessons learned, and that our current generation of protesters could glean some knowledge from, and that is, there are no perfect human beings. There are no perfect movements. There are perfect causes and ideals, goals that we can all reach for together. And one of the things that we really struggle to do, and I think we did a pretty darn good job of it, is telling the whole story. Telling the victories, telling the failures, telling where we wish that our movement for women's equality had done better. So it's the whole story. And when we look back at our history, I think one of the takeaways is that there's something to be learned from our successes, something to be learned from our failures as well. And so never be afraid of the history. Tell the whole history, learn from it, and use it as an opportunity for advancement.
Thanks, Kay. You touched on something I'd like to explore a little further. You've done a lot of work in your life to mentor young Americans and encourage leadership and civic engagement. What lessons do you hope future generations of Americans can learn from the suffragists, including, are there any of their tools or tactics that are still relevant today?
Every single one of them is relevant today, and there's much to be learned from our suffragist heroes. When you go back and you look at the tools that they used, whether it was the arts, looking at the art from that era was phenomenal, and how they used that. Looking at how they used the levers of government. They wrote the letters. They wrote the op-eds. They went and visited their congressmen and senators. They even went to the president protesting outside of the White House and chained themselves to the White House gates. Those are all things that I think are still relevant, and all tools in the tool belt of those who want their voices heard. There's another important takeaway, I think, that would be relevant for our young people today. And that is that we were gifted in this nation with the constructs for protest. And we can achieve goals within those constructs. And what I mean by that is the violence was actually committed upon them. They were not violent people. They were willing to take the consequences for their civil disobedience. And they did it, with such dignity and grace, whether it was being confined in prison or half starved to death. They used every tool at their disposal. They did it with dignity and grace. They did it within the confines of the laws that were given. And when they broke the law, they took the consequences, and that was a form of civil disobedience. I can't think of one thing that the suffragists did that would not be a relevant tool today. Whether it was the marches that they did, the protests, and I think it is an actual guidebook for how to bring about change, dramatic change. And, that's one of the reasons I love the study of history. There's so much to be learned from reading, understanding history, and using that knowledge for advancement today. There's a lot that we should and could be working on together in our country. And the final one I want to talk about is that we could learn and share with the young folks today is how they formed coalitions in order to accomplish a goal. And they worked across party lines, they worked across ideological and philosophical lines to get it done. And they didn't always agree on everything. There were lots of disagreements within the suffragist movement. But having said that, they knew what the common goal was and they worked towards it. And I think that's one of the things that I liked most about my time on this commission, operating as they did and modeling our time as they did. I think we were able to come together and celebrate one of the greatest movements in American history.
If I could just pick up on what Kay said, and I salute everything that she just elucidated, was that I would say to the young people today, because it was about remembering, reflecting, and recommitting. And so many other events happened during the life of the commission, from the pandemic to the organizing after George Floyd's death and Black Lives Matter movement that really raised the consciousness and reckoning for the United States on issues related to race and ethnicity. That don't agonize, organize. And what the suffragists really built as their move for the 19th Amendment on the First Amendment. We had the First Amendment of the Constitution of free speech, a free press, the right to organize, enabled us to have the protection for organizing our own social movement. And the history of social movements in this country are a legacy that we've exported to the world, that in many instances, learning how to do organizing grassroots, large numbers of people, organizing around a common cause could change the world. And it's been used by dissidents and those that wanted to either get democracy or expand democracy around the world. It's been one of our great exports on how to do it. But what I would learn from say to the young people, as Kay also said, participating in social change through a social movement is not an event. It's not only going to a single march, it's a devotion. And it's to use every tool at your disposal, from creative artistic expression to large mobilizations to really going directly to the centers and pinnacles of power. But you've got to keep at it. So when you claim your power, you have to claim the commitment to be able to get power and then to use power in a way that it empowers other people.
I'd like to add one other thing, which we sort of referred back to 100 years ago. Those folks in 1918 and 19 were in the Spanish flu pandemic. And there are photographs out there of people, trying to move forward for suffrage wearing masks. And that was a brutally hard time, and yet they still protested. They still showed up outside. They still talked to people. They kept their focus on what was most important to them, which was to seize and get the right to vote, notwithstanding, sort of the storms and raging. You had World War I, you had the pandemic, you had all kinds of horrible things. And the group navigated those, I think, with surprising dexterity, almost not quite finesse, because there were some spots that weren't so finesseful. I'm not sure what the right word is, but they nonetheless kept on. And I think that was something that, for all of us, we really began to look around starting in March saying, my goodness, history is repeating itself. So that was very, very interesting.
You know, Barbara, you mentioned something that I think is another lesson for young people, and we sort of talked about it a little bit, and that is the time it took from Central Falls to Tennessee. And I want to say to the young people who are out there today, sometimes when you're fighting for something worthwhile, you've got to be willing to stick with it and keep going and not be discouraged, because sometimes it could take 70 years to get there. But they didn't stop. They didn't get discouraged. They kept fighting, and they eventually won.
So don't agonize, organize, and keep focus is what it sounds like the bottom line message is. So my last and favorite question, and then if we have time, we'll turn to questions that were submitted on social media. I'd like each of you to answer, and Senator Mikulski, we'll start with you again. So imagine you're throwing a dinner party in non-COVID times, and you can invite one suffragist. Who would you invite, and what would you ask her?
Well, first of all, it would be hard for me to invite one suffrage, because suffrage was a movement. Suffrage was a social movement. And who I'd like to invite were the women from Howard University, the Deltas. Those brave women who had just a few years before established a sorority at the esteemed Howard University, but they were excluded from the famous march in 2013 in front of the White House. But they came anyway. They weren't going to be excluded. And when they stepped off the curb into the march, they stepped into history, and they changed history. And they claimed their power. I would like to ask them and say, what gave you the courage to do that? We're sure that there were so many concerns about your physical safety. Your parents had given you the opportunity to go to a college, a great university, in a very still difficult social climate. What gave you the courage, and what were your hopes and dreams? Were you envisioning legislation? What were you envisioning? I would want to know that, because in learning about what gives you courage, how you wanted to claim your power, and what were your hopes and dreams, we could learn a lot of lessons for today.
Very good. Who else? Who would you invite?
Oh, I'll go.
Yeah.
Technically, some don't consider her a suffragist. I do, and it would be Harriet Tubman.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
I adore her. In my office, I have one of the biggest portraits of her I've ever seen. It's about 4 feet wide and about 5 feet tall. And when I look into her face, and she had a rather imposing personal presence, she actually inspires me, because written across the bottom is one of her quotes that talks about keep going. No matter what happens, keep going. It's the tenacity. So I'd like to have her over for dinner and cook her favorite meal for her and have a conversation about how she managed under the odds to keep going as she fought for abolition of slavery, and as she fought for women's right to vote. 2 issues which intersect for me and are very, very important, and embodied in that one person is someone who fought tenaciously for both. But there had to have been so many discouraging times, discouraging days when it didn't look like she was going to make it out of the woods, or she would live long enough to see women get the right to vote. And when I look at where we are in our world today, and I get discouraged about where we are with the climate of conversation and dialogue in our country, and I get discouraged, I look to her. And if she could sleep in the woods at night and run for freedom, if she could keep going year after year after year to fight for women's right to vote, I can wake up tomorrow morning and start all over again as well. But I really would like to know from her how she found the inner strength to do that.
Let me go next. I thought about this a lot when we were out in Virginia with Occoquan and Alice Paul. She'd be the person that I would invite to have supper. I would tell her she could eat what she wanted when she wanted. She wouldn't be force-fed. But what I'd want to ask her is, she was so brutalized and so mistreated at that workhouse. And what was she thinking? What gave her the notion that she was going to just not quit? She was going to prevail. And that was the turning point. When the word got out about how they were treating these women who had been arrested for daring to vote, thrown into jail, not fed or force-fed, what was the guiding principle or guiding phrase? What did she say to herself so that she knew that she would do it again, and she would do it again, and she would do it again? I think she is very, very inspiring, pretty amazing woman.
Yes. I know you admire her, Colleen.
Yes, yes. But when I thought about who I would want to talk to the most, there really were two architects at the end of the movement, the last 10 years of the women's suffrage movement. One, of course, was Alice Paul, and the other one was Carrie Chapman Catt. And we don't have, with Alice Paul, because Alice Paul was so young, actually, when the 19th Amendment was enacted, we have decades of a paper trail from Alice Paul, all of her work with the National Woman's Party, her work for the Equal Rights Amendment, and then many historical interviews that she did even into the 1970s, looking back at her work to promote and to enact the 19th Amendment. So we have great transcripts of actually understanding Alice Paul's historical perspective and seeing women decades after the 19th Amendment. We don't have that, unfortunately, with Carrie Chapman Catt. She died, not immediately, she died in 1947. But so I would love to be able to talk to Carrie Catt, the other half of the strategy movement, the inside strategy versus the external strategy that Alice Paul played. Asked her what her thinking was, how she put together the famous winning plan that was really the other half of the equation for the success of the women's suffrage movement, and also talk to her about her legacy as well, which of course included the League of Women Voters. So I think she's a tremendous figure and really is the other side of the coin to Alice Paul.
That's very true. And I learned recently that I think Alice Paul lived until 1977, which was just, you think of suffragists in their 1910s outfits, and it was just shocking to me to think how not so long ago that really was. So I'd like to add my 2 cents on this topic. So I would invite, I think, Susan B. Anthony over for dinner, not to ask her something, but to let her know something. So she did not live to see the passage of the 19th Amendment, but she was certain that women would gain voting rights. But she was also pretty certain that people, especially young people, would forget how difficult it was to achieve the vote. And she wrote, they have no idea of how every single inch of ground that she stands upon today has been gained by the hard work of some little handful of women of the past. And what I'd love to tell her is how today, after every election, men and women of regardless of political party, make a sort of pilgrimage to her gravesite in Rochester and put their "I voted" stickers on her headstone, and just let her know that we haven't forgotten her or the other women who fought so long and hard for our voting rights. So it is now time to move on to questions that we received on Twitter. And I think this question could be answered by any of you. So Catherine B. asks, is there anything from your experience leading the commission this year that was completely unexpected, either good or bad?
I think
I was going to take that one.
I love the fact that I did not realize that we were going to have this wonderful group of women parachutists who were so excited about this. They just came into our lives. They planned to jump out of an airplane together, hold hands, and then have smoke trails. And they'll do this in 2021 when the travel for all these people can do it. But that was so unexpected. They wanted to go sky high, as it were, to show how hard these women worked, and they hope to have a national record, or international record, when they do this in the spring. So I hope people will stay tuned.
Yeah, the parachutists, the skydivers were fantastic. When I first heard about that, I was like, oh, that's random. But then that became actually one of the most inspiring parts of the whole year for me. That and the forward into light, lighting up the buildings, both felt so unifying. Who else would like to answer this question?
I'll say for me was, but for this commission, there are relationships that I never would have had the opportunity to have, and that was a surprise to me. I've been on so many commissions throughout my career, but this one was pretty special in some unique ways. First of all, it was all women. Secondly, it was one of the most diverse groups of women that I've ever had the privilege to be in. And I was really surprised at how important it became to me to be a part of this and what those relationships mean. There are some lifelong relationships that are going to come out of this commission. And I covet that for many of the young people in our country today. Step outside of your tribe. Step outside of your bubble. Step outside of your comfort zone. There are some incredible human beings that you could be friends with, that if you stay right within that bubble, that tribe, that comfort zone, you'll be missing out. And I think when I am challenged and pushed and questioned and prodded by people that don't all think like I think, I end up being a better person for it. So that was a big surprise for me and a big plus. So I'm grateful for that.
Well, for me, it wasn't a surprise, but really it was the relationships. We came from very different backgrounds and also philosophical orientations. But I felt under the leadership of working with Kay reminded me of another Kay, Senator Kay Bailey Hutchinson, where we were able to bridge reaching across the aisle to bring the women of the Senate together to work together on certain issues. And you know how it started? First of all, our commitment to a zone of civility, in which our conversations and all were based on mutual respect. As we worked on specific projects, we developed mutual trust, and then we were able to work and advance a mutual agenda for the commemoration of suffrage while following the principle, assiduously following the principle of nonpartisanship. And I think it not only worked well within the commission, but I think set a tone for those of us also who were watching the commission to do the same. The other thing that I'm going to do a shout out is for our public institutions and our public servants. I think Kay would join in me saying we were able to have an effective commission because of the Smithsonian family and the Library of Congress. And look at the role of the Library of Congress. Look at the very important role the Department of Interior played, not only in helping provide leadership on the commission, but even in the midst of the shutdown, putting on exhibits, doing, and again, a nonpartisan way, important commemorative activity was just, we need to have an independent civil service that is able to work this way. And then the third thing was on Suffrage Day. I got to tell you, it just brings tears to my eyes to see the legacy video. The flyover of an all-women's helicopter military team was a three-goosebump affair. The lighting of public buildings and Niagara Falls and so on was so inspirational. I'm really sorry that the media did not give the press that it deserved, because it was inspirational. And then when those skydivers jumped out and, formed their iconic things in the sky with such bravery, what it was it showed kind of inspiration and it energizing. Our democracy, our politics might be a little rocking and rolling, but our democracy is in good shape. And what we need to do is claim our power, and for the movement to keep on going, to remember, to reflect, and to recommit on keeping our democracy strong.
Well, that seems like a perfect way to wrap up the session today. So we'd like to conclude, and I'd like to thank our distinguished panelists, Senator Barbara Mikulski, Kay Coles-James, Colleen Shogan, and Susan Combs. It has really been a privilege serving with you all on the commission, and I'm proud of the work we did to honor the generations of women who fought so long and so hard for our right to vote and for our full and equal participation in governing our country. So thank you all, and thank you to everyone who joined us today, and everyone stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you.